Ms. Taethong.
Chair Smith, Co-Chair Merkley, and other distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for your steadfast and groundbreaking leadership on the Tibetan issue. Thank you for this honor to be able to speak here today. I just want to start by making it clear that I am speaking of Tibet as Tibetans know it. The entire Tibetan plateau, 900,000 square miles, made up of 3 historical provinces of Utsang, Kham, and Amdo, and with a total Tibetan population of what is today around 7 million Tibetans. China misleadingly claims that there are only 3.2 million Tibetans in Tibet because they count only the Tibetans in the Tibet Autonomous Region. That is central and western Tibet, mostly. They've taken all of eastern Tibet, and they've carved up and subfragmented Tibetans and the lands that they live on into 4 Chinese provinces and 12 autonomous prefectures and counties. And in this way, they distort and confuse people about what is the true picture inside of Tibet. For 70 years, generation after generation of Chinese leaders have tried to break the faith and the loyalty of the fiercely independent Tibetan people to His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, to Buddhism, and to a distinct Tibetan identity that existed for well over 1,000 years before the People's Republic of China was even founded. But after using countless strategies, resources, and unimaginable violence, Xi Jinping now believes the best way for China to conquer Tibet is to kill the Tibetan in the child. He's doing this by taking nearly all Tibetan children away from their families and from the people who will surely transmit this identity to them, not just their parents, but their spiritual leaders and their teachers. And he's handing them over to agents of the Chinese state to raise them to speak a new language, practice a new culture and religion, that of the Chinese Communist Party. A little over a year ago, Tibet Action released a report showing that at least 800,000 Tibetan children are now living in a massive network of boarding primary, middle, and secondary schools across all of historical Tibet. This shockingly high number means that at least 3 out of every 4 Tibetan children in all of historical Tibet from ages 6 to 18 are now separated from their families and living in a state-run colonial boarding school system where the medium of instruction and the entire curriculum is focused on fostering loyalty to China. Tibetan is taught as a single language class, if at all, and Tibetan culture is most often reduced to nothing more than dance and song and tokenized wearing of traditional Tibetan clothing. The practice of Tibetan Buddhism is, of course, strictly prohibited. China doesn't hide the fact that these schools exist. There's plenty of online propaganda claiming the students in the boarding schools are happy and receiving a modern education. This propaganda nearly always features very prominently that single Tibetan language class. But what it hides and what is not included in our report is the existence of boarding preschools. Though we were hearing reports from Tibet that parents were being forced to send children as young as 4 and 5 away, we could not find any details on where they were being sent or what schooling they were receiving. It was only on the eve of actually releasing our report that we met an expert eyewitness who'd recently fled from Tibet and who confirmed the existence of the mandatory boarding preschools for children living in rural areas of Tibet. Dr. Gello, a Tibetan academic who holds a PhD from the University of Toronto and has over 30 years of experience in the field of education in Tibet and China, estimates that an additional 100 to 150,000 Tibetan children, at least ages 4 to 6 years old, now live in these boarding schools. He's visited more than 50 himself. He's seen the children are required to live there Monday to Friday, where they're immersed in a completely Chinese learning environment, including participating in war reenactments where they're dressed in PLA uniforms or Red Army suits. One Tibetan teacher describes the situation in her area like this. Usually there are very few Tibetan teachers. The majority are Chinese. So teachers only speak in Mandarin and conduct all school curriculum in Mandarin, including nursery rhymes and bedtime stories. When the children join primary school, hardly any of them can speak Tibetan. Dr. Gello witnessed the impacts of these preschools in his own family when, just after 3 months of being in one, children in his family who'd grown up in an entirely Tibetan-speaking household preferred to speak in Chinese. He saw them growing emotionally distant from their parents and grandparents and acting like, as he says, guests or strangers in their own home. Imagine your loved ones at this age, and try to imagine the heartbreak that this is causing for these families. I have a 6-year-old and 3-year-old twins, so I'm right now fully immersed in this period of childhood development. Kids at this stage need the care of their parents and their families to help them eat, bathe, get dressed, and maybe even more importantly, to scare away the monsters at night, to comfort them when they're sick or hurt, and to reassure them that everything is going to be okay. Tibetan parents don't want to send their kids away, and most wouldn't if they had a choice. Some parents refuse, and many more want to, but China's repression makes the price of resistance extremely high. In order to avoid sending kids away, some families split up, sending one parent to live with the child in an urban area where they can attend a day school, and other parents report sleeping in cars near the boarding preschools just so that they can be close to the kids at all times. And of course, the children are suffering too. Research by scholars in China and Tibet clearly shows that the removal of Tibetan children from their homes, as well as the highly regimented and isolating boarding school life, is traumatizing Tibetan children. First-hand accounts of Tibetans who attended boarding schools in Tibet show that pervasive racism and discrimination will inevitably lead them to develop feelings of shame and ethnic inferiority. These impacts in Tibet sound hauntingly similar to the residential boarding school system used to eliminate Indigenous identities in Canada, the US, Australia, and beyond. This is because Chinese leaders are pursuing the same strategy for the same reasons in Tibet, East Turkestan, and southern Mongolia, to quell resistance and to consolidate China's rule over foreign lands and peoples. And while Chinese officials argue that the schools in Tibet are fundamentally different from boarding schools of the colonial era, in part because students get to attend schools with modern facilities, they miss the point entirely that what matters is what Tibetans want for their children. And Dr. Gello likes to simplify this issue in another way by saying it's not about how good the school facilities are, but what is happening inside. The fundamental question is who is teaching what to whom? And in Tibet, the answer is clear. The Chinese state is removing Tibetan children from their homes by force or coercion and placing them in schools where they have to speak Chinese to conform to Chinese culture and tradition while stripping them of their own identity, including their religion and their mother tongue. If this is not colonial education, I don't know what is. And when viewed together with the all-out attack on Buddhism and the nomadic way of life, we can see China intends to destroy everything that makes Tibetans Tibetan. And calling it ethnic unity or ethnic fusion or assimilation or sinicization doesn't make it different or any less colonial than what was done by Canada and the US and Australia to First Nations, Indigenous, and Aboriginal people. And what it is crystal clear to Tibetans, just as it's crystal clear to Uyghurs and Southern Mongolians. China's committing genocide in Tibet. And at a time when our nations are finally reckoning with these atrocities, that Xi Jinping is pursuing a strategy targeting children for the elimination of language and culture, a colonial strategy now reviled and condemned around the world, should be, along with the Uyghur genocide, a massive red flag for the international community of the true nature and intention of the Chinese Communist Party. But this doesn't have to be the end of the story. Tibetans inside Tibet have not stopped fighting. We hear the stories of their resistance every single day. And our Uyghur, Southern Mongolian, Hong Kong, and Chinese activist brothers and sisters are fighting too. Now is the critical time for the world to step up and help. And I'll end there and address my recommendations in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you for those very powerful insights and the warnings as to what Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the children. And I look forward offering or proposing some questions to delve even further into that. So thank you so very much. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you so much, Chairman Smith. Thank you, Co-Chair Merkley. And I want to thank all the CECC staff for organizing this important hearing on Tibet. It's a great honor to speak here next to my colleagues, and especially speaking alongside the democratically elected Prime Minister of Tibet in exile, Sikyong Pempasering. It's also very inspiring to be here in this room today with some of the most active members of the Tibet movement who are right here in this room, especially one of the most inspiring heroes of the Tibet movement, former political prisoner Ngawa Sangdola. I just saw her sitting over there. Ngawa Sangdola started fighting for Tibet when she was 12 or 13 years old and went to Chinese prison for simply participating in a non-violent protest. Today she's still out here fighting for the same cause. Oppression produces exile. All oppressed nations have a blessing called diaspora, where stateless exiles are able to enjoy freedom of expression, religion, assembly, and association that they are denied back home. Once upon a time, Tibetans in the diaspora also enjoyed these freedoms. But in the last decade, many of these freedoms have succumbed to the long arm of the Chinese government. From Nepal and India to Sweden and Switzerland. And now, even in Canada and the United States, formal and informal agents of the Chinese government are using some of the oldest tactics of manipulation and some of the newest technologies of repression to bully, threaten, harass, and intimidate Tibetans into silence. To fully grasp why and how China's apparatus of transnational repression targets Tibetans, we must understand its origins. China has historically viewed the Tibetan diaspora as a leading threat to its global reputation. In the 90s, the International Tibet Movement was quite successful at exposing China's human rights violations and generating bad PR for the regime. This was undermining Beijing's foreign policy objectives. It was during this period that the Chinese government launched a new campaign to clean up its global image. But instead of improving its human rights record on the ground, Beijing decided to go after the Tibet movement abroad. China proceeded to develop a sophisticated set of tools, tactics, and strategies to silence not only Tibetans, but also pro-Tibet voices in the international scene. This multi-year project to dislodge Tibet from the global agenda and erase it from public consciousness targets students, activists, artists, academics, former political prisoners, and many elite institutions. Some of my own friends and colleagues in Canada and the United States have gone through traumatizing experiences as a result of being targeted either directly by Beijing or by online mobs of Chinese nationalists who are often acting at the behest of the Chinese consulate. One strategy that Beijing employs with devastating effectiveness is the relationship mapping that links individuals in the diaspora to their families in Tibet. This mapping of family connections allows Chinese authorities to use the fate of relatives back home in Tibet as a pawn to blackmail exiled Tibetans into silence. 2 years ago, I interviewed a Tibetan American in New York who had visited Tibet to see her aging parents. She told me how, toward the end of her trip, her minders from the United Front explicitly told her that her political behavior going forward would determine not only her future chances of getting a visa, but also the safety and well-being of her families in Tibet. Her parents are basically the hostage, and her silence in exile is the ransom. It's a ransom she must pay every day by refraining from actions, online or offline, that may be perceived as critical of China. Agents of the United Front or the Chinese consulate unfailingly communicate this exact message to every Tibetan American who visits Tibet or applies for a visa. Most of the time, they don't get the visa. This transnational family mapping is designed to manufacture a sense of guilt, let's call it advanced guilt, in the conscience of the exile, making the exile feel that her political participation will endanger her family in Tibet. The ultimate goal of this coercion by proxy is the political deactivation of the exile. Another common Chinese strategy is the weaponization of funding to depoliticize institutions and demobilize communities. This mechanism is visible in the case of Pema Tadje, the self-identified Tibetan NYPD officer who was spying for the Chinese government. Exploiting the power of his NYPD uniform, he was trying to manipulate the leaders of the New York Tibetan community. This is what he was saying to them, and I quote, he was saying to the Tibetan leaders, "You guys are paying a monthly mortgage of nearly $50,000 for your community center. I have some very wealthy Chinese friends who can help subsidize your mortgage, but you should stop flying the Tibetan flag at your events. And you should ban any discussion of political issues at this venue." Unquote. By dangling the promise of funding before the community leaders, Pema Tadje was trying to depoliticize and co-opt one of the most important Tibetan-owned spaces in the diaspora. Beyond targeting Tibetan communities, Beijing has used its control, tight control over access and funding to shape political discourse on university campuses, in cultural institutions, academic forums, and even influence the research agenda of budding scholars and aspiring sinologists. Beijing's apologists out here happily exploit the openness of our democratic systems to defend, ironically defend, the world's largest dictatorship. Nevertheless, I believe there are ways to fight this. The US and the West in general has conceded so much ground to China in the last 3 decades and moved the equilibrium so far in Beijing's favor. It is time to reset the diplomatic baseline, and it's time to go back to first principles of historical truth of Tibetan independence and legal right of the Tibetan people to self-determination. It is time to liberate ourselves from the delusion that sweeping human rights under the rug or throwing Tibetans and Uyghurs to the wolves would somehow make China more likely to cooperate on issues of common interest or geopolitical importance. The best way to counter China's transnational repression is to proactively support the Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Kong people's transnational decolonial advocacy for human rights and self-determination, and strengthen the Chinese people's long-standing struggle for democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for that tremendous testimony. This has to be a pivot. I think your point, we have unfortunately bought into a narrative from Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao and all the others that preceded him, that somehow if you go along, you get along, you do more trade and things matriculate from dictatorship to democracy. Nothing like that has happened. So it's time to pivot, and certainly Tibet policy is a place that is just crying out for a reappraisal and for a new initiative on the part of the U.S. government, which is why S-138 and H.R. 533 are so important in that endeavor. Let me just a couple of questions, and I'll yield to the co-chair for his questions. On the boarding schools, if you could, my first human rights trip, I've been to China many times on human rights trips. I never got into Lhasa. Frank Wolf, my colleague, did. I didn't, couldn't get in. But my first trip was actually to Moscow and Leningrad, and in 1982 on behalf of Soviet Jews. And I'll never forget being in what was then, what is now St. Petersburg, going to a museum on atheism, and began to learn that the communist ideology, it either destroys or co-opts all faiths and all exercises of conscience. And they, right now Xi Jinping is using his Sinonization campaign to completely co-opt all faiths and all belief systems or destroy them. We went to this museum on atheism, and while we were there, they were mocking Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in Kazan Cathedral, which had been turned into a museum on atheism. While we were there, all these young pioneers, children that were 11, 8, 10, were going by with guides, pointing to all of the faith symbols and mocking them, because we got a translation from our people that were taking us through it from the embassy, mocking them like I couldn't believe. And all the children were laughing. Look at this, look at that, how crazy, da 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 da. And as they were teaching a militant atheism in the schools. And I'm wondering if you could shed some light on what the consequence of these boarding schools is on the hearts and minds of these children. How long have those schools been in effect, as a tool of repression by the Chinese Communist Party? Do they mock the Dalai Lama there? We know that on the internet, if you put the Dalai Lama into, and I did it at a Beijing internet cafe, and didn't get anything but negatives, unbelievably harsh negatives. And Google was all a part of it. I was on a Google website or search engine in Beijing, and that's the garbage that I got from the censors from the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm wondering, once they get a child with a very impressionable, malleable mind, what is the impact when they're trashing and mocking the Dalai Lama, Buddhism? Do we know how it's affecting the children? Are they turning against, how do they resist? And do they have contact with their parents while they're at the boarding school? Do they, what is the modus operandi there? Do they come home for summer vacation, or I use that in an American context, but do they get time off to see their parents? Because again, it's just. Secondly, if I could, on the population transfer issue, which Mr. Geary, you pointed out, I read one of the Dalai Lama's books, and I remember he had a whole section about population transfer as it was happening. And it's only gotten worse as, obviously, Tibetans, indigenous Tibetans, are increasingly displaced. They also have used the forced abortion, coercive population control program very effectively as a tool of genocide. We know that, and I'm wondering if you might want to speak to the transfer issue. And finally, the whole issue of, and you mentioned it, Mr. Dorji, about the dislodging from the international agenda. There are too many people who just care about the trade so much and about getting along with the Chinese diplomats, who are very smooth, except when they are not in international fora. I've seen them at the UN. I've seen them at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And they're bullies if they don't get their way. I went to a press conference that was being held by the Chinese delegation at the UN Human Rights, and I asked questions. And they closed down the press conference when I got into several human rights issues. They're all miffed. Before that, they were all talking in superlatives about how great the Chinese human rights record is, which it is not, of course. So, again, these pieces of legislation and the prioritization of this by our Secretary of State, our Ambassador to the United Nations, and others, we need to do more to get Tibet further on the agenda. Yes, we have terrible issues with the Uyghurs. We have Hong Kong, Taiwan, all the other terrible, terrible issues. But it can't be at the expense of Tibet. It's got to be reasserted front and center. Maybe you could give us some insights as to how.
Thank you for those questions. Briefly, so restricted access, Tibet is so restricted, so severely restricted, it is nearly impossible to know the exact situation and conditions, not just in the schools, but what it is like when the kids go home, because people are just, the climate of fear is so incredible. There's really not many people who will talk or will give us the kind of rich information and eyewitness accounts we used to get when thousands of Tibetans escaped from Tibet every year into India and Nepal. That number, Human Rights Watch had it at about 3,000 average a year until 2008. Now that number is a dozen maybe make it. Even less.
Yeah, way less.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So we've lost, unfortunately, those rich accounts of what the policy impacts of the Chinese government are inside Tibet. What we do know, though, so the boarding preschools have only been around since, say, 2016. So those little ones, we really don't know how the detail of how they're affected by the political indoctrination. We can only assume the worst. The older students in this current sort of system of boarding schools, it's been about a decade or so that they've been being built and really expanded. And we've heard stories, reports of Tibetan students protesting the removal of Tibetan language in those schools. Other things like that, that let us know that, of course, these kids are still Tibetan, and their allegiance to His Holiness and to Buddhism will be so deeply ingrained in them that it's unlikely they're participating at that level now. But if this goes on for generations, what does our future look like? Exactly. And then as far as how often kids can go home, again, not very often. The preschools seem to allow kids to go home on the weekends, but certainly for the boarding schools that are hundreds and hundreds of miles away, the kids can go home supposedly every few months. Some it's even longer, and many parents can't afford to go get them. So kids will go not home, but to a nearby connection or family member, or even have to stay in the school rather than see their parents.
Could I just ask you, if a parent challenges the child, do they report on them and then they're disciplined or arrested? When the child goes back to the school or the boarding school and they say, Mom and Dad said this, what happens then?
Oh, yeah, I would assume. I mean, you mean if the parents say anything to the child that the child then reports later? Yeah, absolutely. And that's been the way of Chinese authorities in Tibet for decades.
If I may add something very quickly to that, just quickly on what Laden was mentioning about the relationship between the children and their parents is already becoming very, very weak and in the process of being cut right now. Children being unable or struggling to converse with their parents is very much happening. We have heard several accounts and testimonials of this process undergoing right now. One thing that has already happened to so many families is the relationship between children and their grandparents. Because many Tibetan parents speak Tibetan as their first language, but they are able to speak some rudimentary Chinese as a second language in some places. Whereas when it comes to the older generation of Tibetans who are above 50 or 60, the grandparents' generation, they don't speak any Chinese because there was not a single Chinese in Tibet before 1959 or 1949 during the invasion years. And that generation of Tibetans do not speak any Chinese at all. And they still don't, which means many of these children who are in the boarding preschools, they are coming back home when they are able to come during their short breaks in between. And they're not able to say anything, have any kind of communication. Forget about conversing with their grandparents. They're not able to have any communication with their grandparents. So the grandparents have already lost the children. And one thing I want to highlight here is the role, sometimes because, our societies, the structure of our societies are so different that we forget the role that grandparents can play in the development of children. Their psychology, their worldview, their cultural characters. And in Tibetan society, like many traditional societies, grandparents play an extremely foundational role in the development of the children's worldview, psychology, and their fundamental identity. And that's part of the reason why this is particularly dangerous, what's already happening. One quick thing I want to add also about, the second question, China being a bully in so many different scenarios and different arenas. As we all know, this is, nobody likes a bully, but there's nothing worse than a bully who also plays the victim. And the Chinese government has been extremely good at that. They play the victim everywhere, but what they are actually doing, their real character is that of a bully. And they do this inside Tibet, in East Turkestan. They do it to their own Chinese people who are asking for democracy, and they also do this abroad. And one way in which all of these issues, whether it's the Uyghur genocide, whether it's the dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, or whether it's the colonial boarding schools in Tibet, one way that will help us actually be more effective in fighting each of these issues is actually seeing them as a collective whole. Because what the Chinese government is trying to do is isolate each of these issues and get the world to see them as separate issues so that our list keeps increasing, because China's crimes are increasing, right? There are so many. So we get overwhelmed by just the length of the list, whereas I think if we are able to see all of these issues as part of the same root problem of the Chinese Communist Party, which has no legitimacy to rule over a quarter of the world's population, I think that framework will actually help us visualize a roadmap much more easily to dealing with that.
No, I was just asking if we had any clear numbers of the number of Chinese who have come into Tibetan territory. So we don't have them. But I would assume at this point, I mean, a lot of the work that we did at ICT was to stop the population transfer. And population transfer in the Geneva Convention is considered a genocide. I think we can make the assumption that there are more Chinese than Tibetans in Tibetan regions at this point. So let's say that there are 7-8 million Chinese that are now residents and controlling the Tibetan plateau. I think as you were saying, we get overwhelmed by how vast this Chinese machine is. And, you know, we have to rethink in the West every couple of years what our policies are. And there's an interim period where there's discussion and there's a relaxation of movement. There's no relaxation in China. These policies were set many, many decades ago. And this 100-year program for the Chinese to take over the world, they're 50 years ahead at this point, because they're on point of knowing exactly what they set out to do. The mechanisms that they have in place are everywhere now. They're in our universities, they're in our schools, they're in our police departments, they're in our, you know, the deep structures of our intelligence community. They're everywhere. And we have to look at this, but as the gentleman said, we can't get overwhelmed by how big it is. We have to be able to parse it piece by piece and look at it. And the things that mean most to us are our children, frankly. And to look at that the deepest, I think, and this question of continuity of culture from grandmother, grandfather to child is deeply important for us. Could we imagine our own kids being devoid of that kind of cultural continuity and transfer of thoughts and emotions and a sense of who we are in the universe? The Tibetan culture was an experiment of extraordinary visionary possibilities. When Buddhism came to Tibet in the 7th, 8th century, they were tough guys in the community. Tibet at one point controlled all of Asia. They controlled the Mongolians, the Chinese, which is, there wasn't even the Han Chinese at that point. The Han Chinese were a very small, insignificant kingdom that long ago. But Tibet was transformed by Buddhism. They took it seriously. And the institutions were not institutions of generating money or power in a worldly sense, but creating bodhisattvas, perfect human beings who actually generated love and compassion and wisdom. And the institutions of the convents, the nuns, the monasteries were supported by the people. And that's where they sent their kids gladly there to be educated and to foster these incredible ideals, which is, I grew up in a Christian household, compassion, love, care for our neighbors. These were important things to us that we had to learn from our parents and our culture. The Tibetans learned it in the extreme, that this was a life and death struggle between the right path and the wrong path. And the path they chose was love and compassion in all levels of society. Chinese disrupted that completely in 1949 with this invasion. And it was a very unfortunate but necessary thing for the Dalai Lama to leave. When I first became interested in the Tibetans, and I knew very little about the political situation, I was going to go to Tibet. And I had a friend of mine, John Avedon, who had just written a book about the history of Tibet and also the diaspora. And he said, "Why are you going to Tibet?" And I said, "Well, I want to see Tibet." And I said, "Well, you'll just see Chinese there. And you see people who are so coward and fearful. You won't really have an experience there. Go to Dharamsala. See His Holiness there." So I did. And that was really the beginning of my involvement. But it was so stunning to me to see Tibetans living in exile, but within their own communities with this continuity of culture, were unique. And I see it to that community that's sitting here with us today. These people are unique. They're unique on the planet. They're unique in our present society. They have so much to offer us, not just Americans, but the entire planet, of how we can proceed. This breaking of that continuity of love and compassion and wisdom is probably the saddest thing that we've seen. I don't care about the money. I don't even care about the natural resources. I care about this continuity of love and compassion. And that's what we've seen broken.
I read John Avedon's op-eds years past, decades ago. One of them was called The Rape of Tibet, and he talked about how forced abortion was used with absolute impunity against the Tibetan women just to get rid of Tibetans. I mean, it was outrageous. So,
to be fair, they used it against their own people.
Of course they do. Of course they do.
So this discussion
but
here
it was
is not
used
against the Chinese people,
right,
but against a system which is destroying them as well as us.
Thank you so much. Chairman Merkley.
I so much appreciate the testimony that each of you have brought and the experiences that all of you who are attending are bringing to bear in this effort. There's a vote underway in the Senate, so I have a question for each of you. But probably, if I'm going to make the vote, which I need to, I'll ask that maybe take 2 minutes to respond to each question. I wanted to start, Ms. Tetong, noting that in November, on behalf of this executive commission, then Chair McGovern and I sent a letter to the UN seeking a UN investigation on the separation of Tibetan children from their families to these colonial boarding schools. On March 6th, there was a report that the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights did do a study. Did not come from the High Commission on Human Rights, but from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it very much called for an end to the forced relocations and the state-run boarding schools, and had quite a lot of data. So, one section of the UN has pursued an investigation. The question now is, how can we take and push the UN to the next step? What's the most important next step that this Congressional Executive Commission should push for?
Thank you for the question, and thank you also for your efforts in moving this issue, changing this issue, especially at the UN. I think if the members of the Commission could request the administration, members of the Commission, members of Congress, could request the administration to really lead a coalition of like-minded countries in opposing colonial boarding schools at the United Nations, at the Human Rights Council, and other international fora. I think that would play a huge part, make such a contribution to first getting this issue out there, because it's been hiding, or the Chinese government has been hiding it so effectively. And second, for pushing other countries, giving other countries the support they need to get on board. And I think there are a lot of like-minded nations who have these histories of the residential boarding schools and these kind of policies that really have an obligation to lead together with the U.S., like Canada, like Australia, and others.
Yes. Thank you. And certainly this is an agenda that we can continue to push for. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, in that regard. And Mr. Gare, you talked in your testimony, kind of following on that, how we need a unified voice with our European partners. How can we best amplify these horrific circumstances, which, as I was saying to Chairman Smith during the testimony, if you're just hearing the story and you weren't already familiar with it, it would sound like a dystopian world, a few centuries from now on some other planet, in some sci-fi novel. All of these horrific circumstances that are going on. But it's here. It's now. We do know it. We hear it again. And the world becomes somewhat hardened to all of the circumstances that are going awry. How do we build a stronger, unified voice with our European partners?
Well, I think there's a moment now. I mean, there's a high skepticism of China right now. And I think we have to take advantage of that. The Chinese have been very successful in promising separate deals with different countries. There hasn't been a unified effort against China. But I think there is a moment now that there's a high degree of unhappiness and skepticism and a feeling of danger and fear of China at this moment, which is pretty universal, and certainly with our European partners. I think this is the moment for the State Department, for the Commission, for us, for all of us, to make those connections wherever we can. Mr. McGovern and I have talked about this quite a bit, and Congresswoman Speaker Pelosi also. This is, to me, is central to what we can do to actually change things. The U.S. Congress, the U.S. government, the U.S. people have been completely supportive of the Tibetan cause, and we continue to be very strong in what we're doing. These bills are very important, very powerful bills that are winding their way through Congress and have been achieved. The Tibet Support Act of 2002 is huge in declaring support for the Tibetan people and correcting many of the misperceptions through the propaganda of the Chinese government. Now's the time to talk to our equals in Europe, to our friends in Europe, and say, look, this is the legislation that we have started with, and it's taken us decades to get here, but use us, what we have done, to get similar laws passed, similar legislation done in UK and France and Italy. I was on the phone with the Italians today. We're going to be presenting many of these same legislations in Italy, because there's a government there today that is incredibly skeptical of what the Chinese are doing in the world. So this is a moment to take it and take chances of reaching out to our friends around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Gare, and I know this comes from your heart and from decades of advocacy, and we need more American citizens to join you as we are joining you in this advocacy. It's just a tremendous effort, and let's seize this moment as you have suggested. And Mr. Dorji, you talk about the long arm of Chinese government and how they are essentially blackmailing Tibetans who are resident in the United States.
Citizens.
Tibetans who are citizens here in the United States. And this is a practice they're employing not just with regard to Tibet, but in kind of a broad scope of trying to suppress the freedom of speech here, both by threats regarding that person, but also even perhaps more effectively threats against their families back home. And you gave us a very specific example, the name deleted to protect the individual. But it is extraordinarily hard to be an advocate when your family is being threatened. what is the single most effective thing we can do to counter this type of blackmail against Tibetan citizens and Tibetan residents, citizens of the United States, residents here, when their families are threatened back home.
Thank you so much. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, America was a very different place where there would be Chinese students studying overseas. There were all sorts of students here who were participating in political conversations. When I was an undergrad, actually, on my campus, I've seen Chinese students even taking part in all the events, going to debates. They would come to Tibet events. They would come to other political events without fear that somebody is watching over their shoulder. Things have changed a lot. And right now, sometimes I work as a teaching assistant at Columbia University. And what I see on campus, and many campuses these days, is very different. I've spoken to a lot of Chinese students, let alone Tibetan students and Uyghur students and Hong Kong students. Even Chinese students who actually have less reason to fear the Chinese government, even they are terrified of taking part in any kind of activity that might be deemed as remotely critical or even borderline critical to the Chinese government. And I think if we can find a way to make the universities a little bit more responsible to their students, it's the job of the universities to protect their students, the free speech of the students, the First Amendment rights of the students, to take part in events they like to go to participate in protests, to take part in dialogue, to actually even meet with Tibetan students without fear. Many Chinese students are actually afraid to meet with people like me or us, right? Because they don't know who's watching. Because the consulates have actually extended some of their arm and tentacles into the university campuses. And I would really appreciate if Congress and the administration can look into that particular problem, which is happening across many university campuses, both private universities and public universities. And as an immediate measure, establishing some kind of a hotline where people can report tips whenever they see these incidents. My friend and colleague who was in Canada actually was subjected to endless harassment and endless hate speech, intimidation. Even she received death threats from hundreds of people, and the number of comments that she received, like, digital kind of harassment, she was really, really traumatized by that experience. And when I was speaking to her just yesterday, she told me her hope is that in the future, other people don't have to go through that kind of experience.
I'm so glad you mentioned the hotline. So I've been pushing the administration to set up just such a hotline. And the reaction so far has been modest. The first response I got was the FBI wants to just use their standard tip line. And I said, what person being threatened by folks overseas would call up a tip line that has to do with anything in the world, any crime in the world, not knowing how the information will be used, whether the person on the other end speaks Tibetan or speaks Chinese or understands how carefully this information has to be controlled, not to amplify the threat. And if we don't have a way for people to systematically report, then we're not getting just it's not the tip of the iceberg. We're getting like, maybe a 10,000th of actually what's happening in terms of the information we're securing. And I think for us to take on transnational repression, we have to get a huge understanding. There needs to be a transnational repression, a hotline carefully staffed with multiple language abilities, multiple protections, with such confidence that people know that it's not going to be hacked, that they're not going to amplify the problems by reaching out, that the diaspora communities can circulate that information. And I think that would help us really see the full picture and be able to mobilize a much more aggressive response. So I floated that idea last year, and this is the first time I've heard someone bring it back up before the commission, and I'm continuing to seek feedback on it and partnership on it. I hope because you can no longer be free here in the United States of America if your family is being threatened abroad.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chairman Merkley, thank you very much, and thank you for that initiative. I think it's a tremendous one, and hopefully it'll go from modest to full in. Because who wants to call the FBI when you have no idea, as somebody part of the diaspora, who you're talking to? You know, law enforcement to them, and rightfully so, is back home is secret police and people who are surveilling ad nauseum. You know, we also have, and I've actually chaired hearings on Confucius Centers. I had one hearing with NYU that has a campus in Shanghai bought and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party. I actually invited myself and went over there and spoke on human rights. But, you know, it's shocking how complicit higher education, just like the business community, is with the Chinese Communist Party. So
Sure, it's all about money.
It's all about
money. All about money.
It's all about money.
All about money.
But thank you for your testimonies. This hearing, and again, these bills, which I do believe will be passed and signed into law, need to be the pivot. And your voices and your incredible knowledge and depth of compassion is the motivator. You have helped us to see even more clearly what has to be done, and we need to pivot today. So I thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairman.